General Franks, sir, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. Just a quick first question. What is it in your chapter that's most relevant to commanders of large units and their staffs?
Thank you. A couple thoughts. I think anyone, I know I was, would be humbled and honored to command a large formation of American soldiers. In our case, a large armored corps. And so I believe commanders ought to enter into those responsibilities with a deep sense of humility and a sense of fulfillment of trust of their soldiers. And I was reminded of that by a non-commissioned officer who, a few days before we attacked into Iraq, I was explaining our plan of scheme of maneuver in probably more detail than I needed to. And he stopped me in the middle of the explanation and said, "Don't worry, General, we trust you." And I was deeply moved because that non-commissioned officer captured, as non-commissioned officers frequently do, the very essence of our profession. Commanders and leaders are fulfilling the trust of those soldiers, those men and women who are entrusted to our command. And so we ought to do everything in our entire realm of competencies and character and through our leadership to fulfill that trust. So I believe in large-scale operations, and in the chapter in this book, that would dominate everything else. And so if you start there, start with a deep sense of humility in commanding a large armored formation of American soldiers, and in our case, 23,000 British. And then seek to fulfill the trust. How can I best fulfill the trust of those soldiers that have been entrusted to my command? Then you'll get it right. Then you'll get it right. Some of the other aspects that flow from that, I believe you need to figure out with your superiors, if possible, what kind of war your operation you're going into. And there's a wide range of operational scenarios. In our case, it was high-intensity warfare, mobile armored warfare. It may be something else. And then you need to ensure that you get from your current configuration. In our case, it was a Cold War organizational configuration and a Cold War defensive mindset. And we needed to get from that to an offensive armored maneuver organizational configuration, and we needed to shake out the defensive mindset of the Cold War that we had been in for a very, very long period of time. And you never know how deep those persuasions are in an organization until you try to change them. And so we had to get from that to an offensive, rapid attack culture and mindset in the Corps. So that was the first thing, and that took a lot of doing. And then frequently, when U.S. forces are called to go to in an operational scenario, we're either on the wrong continent or we are on the wrong place on the same continent. And that's not because people aren't looking ahead, but that's normally just the way it is. Our enemies don't cause us trouble because we're close by and can rapidly react. We normally have to get there. So the second, I think, second thing I think I would call attention to is the enormous effort to get from where you are in a different organizational configuration while you're changing the culture to the mindset of the mission you're about to go into, is to get from one place to the other, while not taking your eye off the operational scenario. Just a couple other things I would call attention to. I think then you must, an attack is different than a defense. Defense tends to be much more tightly controlled, a lot more control measures. Where in the offense, you want to encourage initiative. You want people to use what the Army calls these days disciplined initiative to achieve the objective. And so you want less control, more command. That's different than the defense. And so you have to get used to adjustments and the ability to adapt. In large organizations, sometimes that's a little difficult. So that would be the second big point, and we learned that quickly in VII Corps. Then the third is you need to figure out what are the maneuvers that will achieve victory. And I use that word deliberately. Victory, success, back to fulfilling trust. I mean, if it's worth doing, then it's worth doing right, and it's worth doing decisively, and our soldiers expect for their effort that we're going to achieve success and victory. And you need to figure that out, what that is, and then go for it with everything that you've got in the organization, and make sure all the pieces and parts of the organization come together to achieve that decisive effect.
Sir, one thing that you mentioned in your chapter is the idea of getting a large unit, in this particular case, VII Corps, positioned correctly for the fight that's coming. And so I wanted to ask you, sir, what are some of the major challenges that entails, and what should today's commanders at echelons above brigade learn from that experience?
I believe the more senior you get, the more you really have to pay attention to force placement on the ground. As a younger commander, if you get a better idea about where you want to place forces on the ground, it causes some turmoil in the organization, but you can get it done. If you make a mistake, or you get a better idea 2 or 3 weeks later about where you want to put an armored division, and you want to move them 20 or 30 kilometers somewhere else, that's a big deal. And if you're time constrained, as we were, you don't want to spend your time moving units around to get them in the right force placement on the ground and in relationship to each other. So you want to try to get that right early on. So I believe that large unit commanders need to have an extraordinary amount of thinking, creative, critical thinking at the beginning, and set things in motion that aren't easily changed later on. One of those is where you're going to place forces on the ground, force placement, who's going to go where, and in relationship to each other. So in our case, early on, we received the concept of the operation, what VII Corps was going to be the main attack, and our mission in our sector, we didn't know really where that was going to be, but we knew that our mission was to destroy the Republican Guards in our attack sector. And so I wanted to get a early idea of how we might do that, and who would be, what units would be in relationship to each other. And when we figured that out, then we could put forces on the ground so it resembled pretty much how they had to attack, and we wouldn't have to keep moving them around. We could devote the time we had to getting ready to conduct a large-scale armored attack, do the long-range gunnery, do the movements of large formations in the desert, and train on those essential tasks that we really hadn't had the opportunity to train on and didn't need to in Germany.
Sir, 7th Corps had been trained largely for a totally different kind of fight, totally different kind of mission being there in Germany. How did 7th Corps make that transition, and what can commanders at echelons above brigade learn about those types of transitions?
I believe, anecdotally, after we got the mission, which was essentially for the Corps, no notice. There were 8 of us in a small little planning group that my immediate superior, General Butch Saint, had authorized me to convene. but for operational security reasons, we limited it to 8 people. And the rest of the Corps was pretty much didn't know anything about it. So when President Bush came on, actually it was Armed Forces Network, and said that we were going to deploy, I mean, it hit everybody like a thunderclap, to include my wife, who thought I was going to meetings related to the drawdown of, because of the end of the Cold War, a drawdown of units and then activation of installations and so forth, when in fact we were planning to go to Saudi Arabia to get ready to do an attack. So I looked around at the early meeting we had, which actually took place the next day. And I realized what an extraordinarily talented team that I had. You have, in large organizations, you have a depth of leadership that can do almost anything. They are, we were all, the senior leadership, non-commissioned officer and officer leadership were all Vietnam veterans. So we'd been through a war. We'd been through all of that. We've been through National Training Center scenarios, Battle Command training programs, so War College graduates, Command General Staff College graduates. So the depth of the organization and the talent that's there, what you want to do is talk about what we need to do back to the fulfillment of trust and what the outlines of the mission might be, and then let them run with that. Let them run with that. Devise an intent as quickly as you can, but then let them run with that and do what they need to do in their own organization to change those cultures from the defense to the offense. And my immediate subordinate commanders, division commanders, were just superb at that. And so we worked at that, and we talked about it a lot. I think the best way, in my own experience in the Army, to change mindsets is through training scenarios. You can talk about it a lot, but I think until you put yourself through some training scenarios, it can be tabletop war games, it can be computer-assisted war games, or actually out on the terrain, and actually do it. Sometimes it's just a lot of talk, and so you just need to go out and do it and say, okay, what did we learn from that? Then do it again. So we started a lot of that. We held one of those in 3rd Infantry Division headquarters up in Wartsburg, and we just kept talking about it through command chatter. What do we need to do? And we set out some major training objectives that we needed to do. Said long-range gunnery, maneuver of large formations in the desert, and other configurations about what would command posts look like in the attack as opposed to the defense. 7th Corps, for example, when I got there, had not ever even been in the practice of using what we called in those days a tactical command post. And so we needed to organize one of those. What would that look like? We ended up with 1 tactical command post and 2 what we called jump tacks, so we could keep up with the formations and our line of sight radio contacts would work. So all of that thinking went on almost simultaneously, and we had a lot of command chatter, and we did some training scenarios that helped us all get our heads in the game, as it were.
Sir, one thing that you mentioned, and I think this is a theme that we see across the book, across the different chapters in Essential to Success, is that a Corps commander really only gets to make a couple of real decisions. That's something that General Scott Wallace really stressed in his chapter about his time in command of 5th Corps. How does a Corps commander go about choosing the decisions that he will make?
I think by the time you get to be a senior commander, you obviously realize, if you haven't realized earlier, you don't need to try to do everything yourself. Back to you have a lot of talent in the organization. And in the course of an operation, I think the more senior you get, the less real critical decisions you get to make. People senior to me had even fewer And I think that's the way it goes. Down at the platoon level, platoon sergeant, platoon leader, you're making decisions, you know, where the reaction time's a nanosecond, especially in battle. So you're making decisions all the time, and it's hard to predict which one's real critical and which one isn't. So I think by the time it occurred to me, by the time I got to be a senior commander and through our own training exercises, that I would probably get 4 or 5, maybe 6 real key decisions. And I needed to figure out what they were to get us to this, Germans call it Schwerpunkt, or the critical fight to achieve victory, achieve our mission. I recall General Wallace, you mentioned him, of course commanded the VII Corps superbly in the attack in 2003. He had invited my former G3, Brigadier General, now retired Stan Cherry, and I over to Europe and talked to them about our operation that took place in 1991. That was one of the big points I made with them in that training session that they had. So I think if you can try to focus your energies on what they might be, then and then let your subordinate organizations focus their attention on what they need to do, the 4, 5, 6, or 10, or whatever it might be for them, and do that in accordance with their own unit and their own capabilities and their own talents in their own organization, then you really have a strong team. If the senior commander is trying to do everything, and I think we know enough now that that just does not work. And it especially doesn't work in the attack when you're looking for that initiative. You're looking for people to exploit the vulnerabilities that they discover at the local level with the enemy and feel authorized and encouraged to go for those openings and that vulnerability. So I thought it was between 4 and 6 was about the right number.
How far in advance does a Corps commander need to make most of those decisions?
At the time, our doctrine said 72 hours. That was great for the defense. That was okay. Actually, in an ironic way, the less successful the defense, the easier the command and control gets, because you're kind of collapsing on yourself. The logistics gets easier, your sectors get smaller up to a point. So we had a series of war games that we went through, and for me it was 24 hours. I figured between being a Corps commander and down to the platoon level, there were about 7 echelons that orders and adjustments to orders needed to be made to get down to the platoon level. So I thought if we could turn around orders to the Corps in a 24-hour cycle, that would be about right in a rapid attack. Our attack took 89 hours. If I used the old doctrine of 72 hours, we just never would have gotten it done. So that's another thing to change from a culture of the defense where things are relatively slower. You're not really maneuvering. You're not moving or maneuvering a lot. Movement being getting to a point of advantage over the enemy, which constitutes then maneuver. So you're not really in that maneuver mode. So 72 hours was probably okay in the Cold War defense in Central Europe, but it surely was not for the operation that we were about to undertake.
Sir, throughout your chapter, one of the things you discuss at some length is the importance of strategic lift and the associated challenges with that. What does a senior commander and his staff need to keep in mind about this strategic lift, and where does this factor into a Corps commander's decision cycle?
I believe senior commanders, personal view, I mean across the Army, need to be aware of the strategic lift, air, sea lift, that's available to them to get their organization from where it is now in possibly a different configuration, and you can look at a range of those, in order to accomplish a mission for our nation and in our national security interest somewhere else on the globe. And so I believe that ought to be factored into readiness, given the current set of strategic lift and the demands for it other places. If we had to go to place X now or within the next 60 days, it would take us 6 months to get there. Maybe at some other point in time with less demand on strategic lift somewhere else, it would take you 3 months to get there. So I believe in readiness calculations. I would encourage that those things be considered. For us, I learned that through our own experience in VII Corps. We were good at moving on the continent because we did a lot of that, getting to our major training areas. We would upload our heavy equipment on rail cars. The Germans and we were very good at that, could do that quickly, rapidly, and get them from our home stations to the major training areas of Grafenbier and Hohenfeld, offload them in the right configurations. Germans even had barges on rivers. They could float equipment from one place to the other. We were very good at convoys. We did a lot of those. German were good at helping us with that. So we were very good at moving on the continent, as it were, at West Germany. And we could get to the port. The difficulty was VII Corps was never going to be a deployable corps. It was never going to go fight anywhere else. That was not in anybody's thinking that I was aware of. Certainly wasn't in mine. We were going to fight right close to where we were stationed and in the configuration that we were pretty much in. Corps in the Army had always been configured to go fight in operational scenarios the best way. They were never fixed organizations. Over years of the Cold War, it became accustomed to believe they were fixed organizations, but they never were. But the Cold War units in Central Europe, U.S. units, were never, we never trained for it. We never even talked about going somewhere else. So I really believe that we need to have that talk, those discussions in our training scenarios, maybe front-end it. We early on after Desert Storm in the Battle Command Training Program, I know we had a deployment seminar, and we talked about that and talked about the availability of sea lift, airlift, and so forth. I think that can also drive the demand for especially sea lift, because most everything you take to a theater is going to go by sea lift, can drive the demand for modern sea lift, roll-on, roll-off ships in tactical configurations. And so I really believe that these discussions need to go on. The demands need to come from major Army, large tactical commanders. And the way the demands can come from that is to include that in training scenarios and in readiness reports. So I really believe strategic lift is a key and vital piece of the readiness of the United States Army. The other services don't have to worry about that much. The Navy is the Navy; they're self-contained. The Navy transports the Marine Corps. That's built into the Department of the Navy organizational structure, and the Air Force deploys their own fighter squadrons. The Army depends on both the Air Force and the Navy to get us somewhere, so that ought to seems to me, figure in our readiness calculations. That was a big lesson that I learned personally. We all learned in Desert Storm. We were halfway there, which was one of the reasons to send us, but the sea lift, the 152 ships we ended up using, were a variety of configurations and the decision got made, not mine, but the decision was made to load those ships, not in tactical configuration, but to take up every available space. And so I recall one of our battalions was on 8 different ships. That complicates things as well. So yeah, that's a large point of discussion. If the Army is called on by our nation to go somewhere with big organizations, then it seems to me worthwhile to include that in discussions, and include it in discussions with other services and with combatant commands about the demands of airlift and sea lift, especially sea lift for the U.S. Army, for large armored type units.
Sir, you note that 7th Corps deployed to Kuwait from a forward deployed position in Germany. And one of my favorite sections of your chapter, and I think often an overlooked point, is how you and your staff plan to support the families of your soldiers who remained in Germany. Could you discuss that process? What did you and your staff do to facilitate that process? And what were some of the major challenges associated with supporting those families?
The consideration of families was a major element of our whole planning for Desert Shield and Desert Storm from our Corps perspective. That goes back to the fulfilling trust of the soldiers, those entrusted to your command, and of course their families. Never before in the history of the U.S. Army had we deployed forward station forces from one operational theater to the other and left the family members in that forward deployed location. It's done routinely now, and the Army does a superb job at that, I believe. Well practiced at it, knows how to do that well. It was brand new for us. And so fortunately, I had a very understanding commander, General Butch Saint, who was United States Army Europe commander. His chief of staff, Major General Bill Burleson, had been a West Point classmate of mine. And so we had a understanding command environment that we really had to work hard at this. So we formed what was called a directorate for this, a colonel by the name of Bob Julian, who had been there for some signal modernization, put him in charge of that. The Pershing Brigade commander with General Saint's okay came to Stuttgart and assumed command of our 7th Corps base, we call it. I didn't like the term rear, I didn't like that, but we call it 7th Corps base. I was selected as chief of staff for that, a really bright, innovative officer who was my resource manager, Colonel Jerry Sin, himself a Vietnam veteran. So you want to get the right people in there. Jerry retired as a lieutenant general, a very talented officer. So we formed this, and then the family members, through their own initiative, they knew what they needed to do, formed essentially family support groups in each of their areas in accordance with the tactical organization of the Corps. They got together for meetings. I remember General Vono, who was Army Chief of Staff at the time, had come over, visited, and we were flying from one place to the other, and he said, Freddie, he always called me that, and he said, you've got to convince the families to stay here in Germany, and we'll do the right thing by them. He was also very supportive, because we don't have a lift if they all want to go back to the United States to go back to hometown or back to their family or relatives back in the United States. And so I said, yes, sir, okay. I didn't think when you had a lot of convincing to do. I remember a reporter asked my wife, Denise, are you going home? And she said, what do you mean? I am home. This is my home. And by and large, the majority of them felt that way. Those who left to go back to the United States, and there were a few, needed to do that for other family considerations. And so they organized themselves. I know my wife threw herself into it. They got together a family assistance center called a fax center where you could get the facts. The big thing you fight are rumors, and they're flying around. So what you want to do is you want to get the emphasis was on communications, what we call today situational awareness for the families. And back home in VII Corps base, they decided to publish newsletters, and they picked that up around the Corps. They named the one in Stuttgart the Sandpaper, very imaginative spouses, and just got after it and tried to disseminate information as best they could. We got a great assist from our German friends and neighbors who offered all kinds of support, to include money for special events, Christmas. They would drop off money and gifts at the front gate of installations. Family members who lived not on our caserns or secure, but lived out in the German area were looked after and secured by the local German Polizei, and in some cases by elements of the German army. The 2nd German Corps commander down in Ulm I had known previously. I had worked for him when he was Corps commander, and I was division commander. So I knew what it was like to work for a Corps commander from another nationality, as the British ultimately did with us. I knew what that felt like. But he was very good. He was call my wife and let her know, as a Corps commander, what he might be thinking of, what I might be doing at the time, since I didn't have a whole lot of communication with my wife. So we had an enormous amount of help from the German people, from the German military, the German government. They bent over backwards to support our families and be there for any kind of assistance. So we worked hard at that. We communicated back and forth when we were deployed to Saudi Arabia, and to provide our family members that situational awareness. It was, I really, I'm extraordinarily proud of our families, and then, as now, our families serve by their own brand of courage. They really do. We ask a lot of our families, a lot of sacrifice for our families. Now in this war for the Army, the multiple deployments, separations, family separation, children growing up, not knowing anything but their mother or dad deploying all the time. And so our families deserve an extraordinary amount of credit. But we were breaking a lot of new ground at that time, and a lot of things we did simultaneously and for the first time. Later got into now what the Army calls family readiness groups, and the Army's ability to do this in a really well organized and planned for and in a very compassionate way.
Sir, you've mentioned a lot about maintaining situational awareness on the battlefield. How did you receive your information in Desert Storm? And you mentioned attack CPs and the jump CPs. Were there any specific challenges associated with the way that you received your information on the battlefield?
I believe what you're trying to do as a senior commander is you're trying to gain situational awareness from a variety of sources. The first way, of course, is from your staff at whatever headquarters you're located. I did not stay. Our main command post, the 7th Corps, did not move during our 89-hour attack. I had discussions with my Chief of Staff, General John Landry, And we decided to tear it down, pick it up, move it, set it back up again, would probably take in excess of 2 to 3 days. And I said to John, this may be all over by that time. So just stay where you are. And we had not, as our attack was successful, we ran out of line of sight communication, but we still had communications with them. And they had communications with Riyadh, which was some 600 kilometers, like Paris to London, in the rear, down 6 floors down in the headquarters in Riyadh, which is where they should have been. So our main command post was not going to move, so then we talked about how will we keep up with the battle we determined we were going to use line of sight, just FM radios of the day. We had a few global positioning systems. I think we ended up with about 3,000 in the Corps. That sounds like a lot, but for 146,000 soldier Corps and a lot of units, 5 divisions, that was not a lot of GPS, and they're mostly handheld. And there were 2 satellites, and at certain times of the day, the screen would go blank. But so when there was no triangulation possible. So we had some GPS. The 1st Armored Division used LORAN, the long-range navigation system, that had been used in the oil fields there in Iraq and Kuwait, and for some reason or other, the Iraqis left the towers up, so it still worked. So we had some of that to aid navigation, but a lot of it was dead reckoning, using a compass and a line of sight for navigation. And all of the communication was line of sight. We didn't have any Blue Force tracker or any of that to know where units were, so we were still using our methods to command and control probably were closer to what had been used in Vietnam and Korea and World War II than they are to the electronic configurations we have these days, and the breakthrough that happened actually right after Desert Storm. So we had old map stickers, acetate fold-over overlays to show various elements of the Combined Arms team. But we determined we were going to use FM voice, and that for the Corps, we were going to have a main tactical command post, which contained 6 of the day M577 set up 3 to 3 backed up against each other with various elements we needed to coordinate the actions of the Corps in that 24-hour cycle. And we also needed 2 what were called jump tacks. We needed 1 for the breach, and we needed 1 to stay up with the enveloping force. So we ended up with 2 jump tacks and a main tactical command post. And I had a lot of talented people who could man all those. But it took some practice for us to work those and to continually gain situational awareness. For me personally, I think the way you do this is that you have to realize that just because you happen to have the same picture, in these days electronic picture, in our days the same map picture of what's going on, doesn't mean you have the same situational understanding. And I think you only gain the situational understanding yourself and with your subordinate commanders is being out and around the battlefield, talking to them, getting their judgments, seeing some of the action yourself if that's possible, and hearing from others, from the G2 if the division commander brings them along, or the command sergeant major in the case of the 3rd Armored Division. I was able to talk a couple of times with Command Sergeant Major Joe Hill. And so you get that sense of feeling of the state of the soldiers in the Corps, how rested they are or not rested they are, how they're handling casualties, how they're handling some of their some of their friends and their fellow soldiers who are getting wounded and killed in actions, and how they're absorbing all that and able to continue to go on, how commanders are handling various changes and surprises. So you need to get out and around the battlefield, and I think you need to get out and around the battlefield today, and I will forever believe that you need that face-to-face. It needs to fuel your own understanding of what's going on. I think in that way you get what the Germans call Fingerspitzengefühl, a sense of feeling, a sense of intuitive sensing of what's happening, so you can better fulfill the trust to your soldiers who are at the platoon and company and even battalion level doing a hard, tough, and often cruel fighting that is in the arena of land combat. So you need to get out and around. That informs you as well. And a lot of it's nonverbal communication. You get a lot of communication that way. And you need to be savvy in being able to read nonverbal communication. I recall the morning of the fourth day, going out to visit the Big Red One after they had conducted an all-night attack and visiting their TAC CP. The division commander was forward in a combat vehicle, I believe it was in a tank, General Tom Ram. And I visited General Bill Carter, who's assistant division commander, and their TAC, just a couple vehicles they had set up. And I just looking around, I talked to some of the aviators who had flown a night attack that night. I saw some captured Iraqi prisoners there. I saw the debris all around the battlefield. And so there's a lot of nonverbal communication goes on too. And you don't get that if you're just staying in your command post. So you need to get out and around, commanders do. So I always figured that probably 20 to 30% of the situational awareness I got was from my own staff at the tactical command post. And sometimes, not because they don't want to, but they can't keep up either, because they don't have the liberty of being out and around like I do. Although I did send my G3 out to get around to inform them. And so sometimes their information lags a little bit. So you just need to be able to see it yourself. So 20 to 30% I got from the tactical command post, and I think another 30 to 50% I got from this nonverbal, just seeing things personally myself, and also talking to my subordinate commanders, getting their judgments, getting their ideas for the operation in the next 24 hours, getting their thoughts, getting their input. How's it going with you? And then learning some things. And then the other, maybe 15, 20% or so, you would get from your own recall, your own background experience, your own reading of history, your own experience in command, your own previous combat experience, and all that mashes together in a synthesis way to allow you to reach some conclusions. Then there's another phenomena going on I described in the book, or in the chapter, about being in the zone, if you will. I think your intense desire to do whatever you can to fulfill the trust of your soldiers who are entrusted to your command releases a sense of connections in your intellect, in your emotional makeup, that you really don't have the ability to do in other times, in less intense situations. And so you're able to connect up bits and pieces of information in a synthesis way to create a pattern, so to be able to anticipate what the enemy's doing, what you're doing, and what you need to do to continually get your own organization at the right place and the right time and the right combination, and then your subordinate leaders and your soldiers will take it from there and continue to keep them in that situation. So I believe you get what I would call the in the zone type. People talk about that in athletics a lot. I really believe that happens in combat as well. If you immerse yourself in this intense motivational sense to fulfill the trust of the soldiers who have put their full trust in you and are giving you and your commanders just everything they got to accomplish the mission. And I think that's one of the ways you fulfill that trust. And that happens, and that happened to me. I really was never able to recreate it in any other types of training scenarios, but that in the zone phenomena, I really believe it happens if you allow yourself to get out there and around, feel the pride of the soldiers, and then also feel their pain and see some of that and hear from them and get those nonverbal communications.
Sir, how do you command a corps that's spread across the desert while concentrating your combat power for decisive times and decisive locations? In other words, how do you remain organized for combat despite the chaos at a large unit level?
It's a great question, Joe. I think, to me, at least my own experience in combat in Vietnam and when I was a major and in Desert Storm, is that combat, land combat, is chaos on a grand scale. I mean, it really is. And what you're trying to do is not necessarily reestablish order. Order is only important as it allows you the coherence in your formation, organizational alignment, to bring all arms and joint forces together in a decisive way against the enemy, and have that edge and to be able to keep that edge. And you want enough coherence to be able to do that. But what you're not trying to do is establish order. You're trying to win. You're trying to achieve victory. You're trying to achieve success at least cost to your soldiers. And reestablishing order is not that. As a matter of fact, you try to induce chaos in the enemy. And sometimes one unit gets a little out ahead of another in the attack, or units aren't exactly positioned on time, or artillery might have a little trouble keeping up here or there. But that happens. And I think you have to allow for that in order to continue to achieve the momentum and continue to sustain the initiative that is needed in a rapid attack. And so it's not order you're after, it's achievement of the mission, it's victory, and getting your soldiers and your units to the right place in the right time, in the right combination, and then keep them that way. And then if things don't exactly work right, then absorb the responsibility for that and get after it and make sure it gets back, your attack momentum continues to be achieved towards that success and that victory. I really believe that what commanders really need to do is establish an intent. Field Marshal Slim, in his book Defeat into Victory, calls it, he said, one thing I did in the order was the intention. And I really believe commanders need to do that themselves. They need to think all this through. They need to do all the critical thinking and sometimes synthesis to put bits and pieces together. And then in their own thought pattern, write this down. I'm not particularly attracted to formatting it. I think various commanders can do it differently in different ways. I always had a battle inside the Army about it. We like to format everything, so we came up with this format of a mission intent. I never really liked that. I just thought commanders, when they get to senior levels, are really experienced people. Probably have had, especially today, a number of combat experiences commanding units at various echelons, as a lot of our senior commanders these days do. So they know how to do a commander's intent, and I really think you need to work hard at that. So I brought along with me my own attempt at that in Desert Storm, and I wrote it down in one of those blue office memorandum forms. It's like a 5x8 piece. And you'll notice I wrote it in pencil in order two, allow myself the ability to scratch through it and change my mind and so forth. And then finally do that. But you've got to do this yourself, because until you get it, you force yourself to articulate it. Best articulate it by writing it down. It forces you to have a clarity of what the intention of this entire operation is. And you may think you have that clarity until you try to express it. And then maybe you stumble around and you're not quite sure of what it is you want to say. So I believe if you force yourself to write it down, that's the surest way, as we all know, in our own thinking process, to be sure we've got this pretty close to what it needs to be, and there's great clarity to it. People can understand it. Now, you get a lot of help, you get a lot of suggestions. You want to talk about this in your leadership councils and in your war game scenarios, but in the end, it's got to be the commander's thinking, and I would really encourage commanders to spend the time to write it down themselves so there's great clarity in it, and then get it in the order, and then that thought dominates the operation. And then within that, you can have a lot of initiative, and your subordinate organizations and commanders. In my own case, I had really great and experienced commanders: Ron Griffith in the 1st Armored Division, Butch Funk in the 3rd Armored Division, Tom Raymond, the Big Red One, John Tillelli in the 1st Cavalry Division, and then General Rupert Smith with the 1st British Armored Division. And then they'll take it from there, as well as your artillery, in our case, Corps Artillery with 4 artillery brigades in the Corps Artillery, General Abrams, and then your other elements of your military police and signal and intel and engineers. So then that thought keeps us coherent. That's a coherence maker in and of itself. And then you can have this discipline initiative that supports achievement of this intent. And I think that's the way you do it. And then, of course, you got to pay attention to where units are, how long it's going to take unit to move from point A to point B in the desert, and have some feel for friction, chance, chaos that happens. It's going to happen. How weather intervenes. For example, terrible 4 days of weather we had, attacking sandstorms, a lot of heavy rain in February in the Iraqi desert. I remember captured Iraqis telling us, how did you attack through all that? All the sandstorms, rain, and so forth. We never expected you to attack through that, as happened in 73 Easting and other attacks in the Corps. So I think the first way you achieve coherence is through thinking it through, getting the intention clarified throughout the entire organization. And then you see to it that your units are in the right configuration to each other. They are given adequate maneuver room within which they can achieve their own interpretation of this intent for their own sectors. And then you use a variety of techniques for how you reinforce the main effort. We tried to do that with artillery and aviation, because those are elements you can rapidly reuse artillery and aviation. Aviation can move from one point in the battlefield to the other and quickly reinforce places. Artillery can pretty much do the same thing. From where they're positioned, they can fire in a couple different sectors. It's harder to reposition maneuver units. That takes a while. And so we tried at the senior level to reinforce the main attack through use of aviation and artillery. So we tried to do the right, choose the right units for the right mission, for example. 1st Infantry Division, Big Red One, had practiced breaching operations. They knew that pretty well. General Rames said to me, volunteered to do that with his division, and so we gave him that mission. The 1st Armored Division was the only division really in the original 7th Corps in Germany. So I gave Ron Griffith the outside attack zone, and they would have the furthest to go, but we had worked with each other over the course of the previous year, so we knew each other. All that builds in coherence. General Butch Funk was a very experienced commander, had commanded out at the National Training Center. He could absorb a variety of missions, from Corps Reserve to the Middle Attack Division, to changing sectors, width of sectors, so put him in that sector. 1st Cavalry Division, when we received them from Central Command to stop a preventive attack or a spoiling attack by the Iraqis. They did our feints and demonstrations in the Rugi Pocket, which deceived the Iraqis as to how we were going to attack. They thought we were coming up the Wadi al-Batin when in fact we were going 100 kilometers to the west. Now all that experience, choosing the right people for the right missions, the British to defeat the Iraqi Tactical Reserve, which was fully within their capabilities, embraced by General Smith and the British chain of command. I think that all builds coherence and confidence ahead of time. We also did a rehearsal of the actual breach and the British passing through the Big Red One, did that twice. Builds confidence. That also ensures cohesion. We moved from our tactical assembly areas to our attack positions in the exact same configuration to include turn and right 90 degrees that we would later use in our execution of our Frag Plan 7 to conduct the main attack against the Iraqi Republican Guards. All of that builds confidence and builds coherence in your attack, and I think you try to do all of that.
Sir, the thing that strikes me is just how much all of this is tied together, too. For instance, you talk about the difficulty of repositioning a maneuver unit, but once that's tied to, I think, an earlier point that you made, all the more difficult when that maneuver unit is out of position to begin with.
Yes, very, very true, Joe. Yeah, you. I really believe senior commanders need to pay a lot of attention. Land combat commanders, Marine and Army, need to pay a lot of attention to force placement, positional advantage, and how you go about doing it. Who goes in what sector, and who goes where in relationship to each other. And it's still dependent on terrain. Afghanistan's today different than Iraq. For us, the flat desert allowed you to go almost anywhere. So I really think force placement is extremely important. And getting that right early on, that early burst of intellectual energy by senior commanders and staffs, so necessary to set in motion the right focus on achieving the ultimate mission, the right focus on training, the intense training, to be razor sharp in your new set of mission essential tasks. As we were razor sharp in our situation for the defense in Central Europe, now we had a different mission, and we needed to be as razor sharp in these new training tasks for our new offensive mission. And all of that builds coherence. And you're looking at coherence, and you're not looking for order necessarily, you're looking for coherence in the continuous sustainment of a coherent attack. And sometimes there's deliberate speed to get from point A to point B, and sometimes there's tempo. Tempo being you're more concerned with retaining combined arms coherence. Sometimes, though, you need deliberate speed. If an artillery brigade's trying to catch up to the division it's supporting, going through the breach, then they need to move at deliberate speed to get to a position where they can support. In this case, that example was 42nd Artillery Brigade and the 3rd Armored Division.
Sir, how does a disciplined study of military history profit those commanding or staffing echelons above brigade?
I think that's a wonderful point to make. I've always been fond of military history personally. I think my generation was schooled in the use and application of lessons from military history. I think you have to have a robust reading program in military history to stay current in what's going on, but also learn from the past. And I believe you need to try to understand it. I believe, as some historians said, you need to understand the context within which all this took place, as we've talked about some here today. And then you can learn from what has gone before. You know, some things. My first professional reading book was War as I Knew It by George Patton. I bought it when I was a cadet at West Point. And in the back, he's got some wonderful jewels of command and lessons of command about information is like eggs, the fresher the better, sayings he's had. And so fresh intelligence, the perishability of tactical intelligence. That's George Patton writing that back in 1944, 45. And that's as relevant today as it was back then. Now, all the equipment they use and the way they commanded, controlled, and all that is pretty much obsolete. But so you can find those gems that have just as much applicability today in terms of human interaction and commanding and leading, being privileged to command and lead soldiers, as those who have gone before, and other people of other nations as well. I took 5 books with me to Desert Storm. Not that I wanted to use them as textbooks, but I just wanted to refer to them. I took Slim's book, Defeat into Victory. I like his whole idea, focus on the intention, getting that right, spending the time to do this, write it yourself, and spending the intellectual energy to get that right, to gain clarity. I took Clausewitz, War as I Knew It, Curley Barnett's book on desert generals. I found that the operations in North Africa in World War II, actually prior to Rommel getting there, when the British were fighting the Italians, and some of O'Connor's insights were he said, being a war in the desert is like war at sea. You can go anywhere you want, but 2 things are key: control of the air and logistics. And that was just as true for us in 1991 as it was for them in 1940-41. And then Rommel's war in North Africa, about his whole scheme of maneuver, about his leading from up front, getting out around the battlefield, as I've described earlier. It's so important, getting that finger Spitzengefühl that Rommel talked about. And I always liked his definition of risk and gamble. He said a risk is a chance you take, and you have to take a risk all the time. Combat is a big risk, but yet a risk is a chance you take to achieve the mission, to gain advantage over the enemy, to sustain the initiative, that if it doesn't work, you can recover from it. And then occasionally you need to take a gamble. You need to gamble to gain this edge over the enemy. And you have to weigh whether it's worth it or not, because by his definition, a gamble is a chance you take that within your own means, you don't have a chance to recover from it. Somebody else, higher headquarters or other assets, may have to bail you out. So you may want to check and see whether those might be available. And you might even want to talk it over with your next senior commander. So I always liked his definition of risk and gamble. And then I liked On the Banks of the Suez by Wolf Heckman, and about the Egyptians and the Israelis. I got to visit that battlefield later, but about preparedness, about how you shake a culture of the defense, which the Israelis were in along the Suez Canal, and you get into habits of thinking that lull you into a false sense of security. And so that whole phenomena of going, in our case, going from a defensive mindset in Central Europe, so necessary for the successful achievement of that mission, to an offensive mindset, which is a total different set of the way you look at the battlefield, which we had to do. So I found elements of all those 5 books very, very helpful. Clausewitz, of course, and I think it's essential to the kit bag that a senior commander have, and I really think they're missing a lot if they don't continually read and study military history, go out on battlefields as they possibly can. I know while I was the chair in the Simon Center for the Professional Military Ethic at West Point, we started, I did a battle command elective with seniors, and as part of that, we started a staff ride to Gettysburg, and continued that. They still do that in other formats. But you can learn from that battlefield. You can see Grant, Lee, and the command methods of commanders on both sides there, good, bad, and ugly, and they have direct applicability today.
Sir, I have something that might be a little bit of a trick question, but I just wanted to follow up on your reading of military history. Do you have one of those works of military history that stands above the others, a favorite you may call it, or do you have favorites for different reasons? Or I'm just curious.
I tend to like the commanders. I always tell, I said, advise people, I said, if you can, read accounts of people who have insights in themselves and either wrote the book themselves or somebody helped them write it. People who were there, who were present. You can get that from journalists. The Long Road Home by Martha Raddatz, for example. She was there with the 1st Cavalry Division with Pete Corelli, so forth, so as division commander. But people who were there on the ground and saw it themselves and experienced it, maybe were out there living with the soldiers for a while, felt that pain and pride, saw the human dimension of what was going on. So I have them from different eras. You know, I like, you know, I mentioned Patton. I like the Korean War book, a whole chapter on Kevlar Legion, a whole chapter there about preparedness in the Korean War. I like, you know, stories from Vietnam. So every era, I really don't have any particular favorites. There's a lot of great books written by soldiers themselves from this current war, from the beginning in 2001 right on up to the present time. So those that I took, I really like Slim's book. There's a lot of language in there is no longer appropriate to today. Clausewitz, of course. I liked Patton War as I knew it. Those are pretty much my favorites. And then recently I've done a lot of work as a volunteer in post-traumatic stress disorder and traumatic brain injury. I think we bear a responsibility after the war to see to it that our veterans, and especially those we served with, have the opportunity to continue to follow up with medical treatment as that's required. And so you maybe try to continue to inform yourself about what's available, what isn't available, what those phenomena are, and did that from both Vietnam and Desert Storm. So I like to keep up to date with that too, so I can better advise soldiers and so forth that might have served with me all the way back to the beginning point about, I think you go on fulfilling that trust with your soldiers that you were privileged to serve with in a humbling way, to command them in combat. You continue to fulfill that trust for the rest of your life. And that's fulfillment of trust. So I like to read and stay informed about that so I can give advice or intervene when necessary with soldiers that need help, or with other agencies who can provide that help, or even do studies that will help soldiers who have been wounded and otherwise have visible and invisible wounds of war. So I like to read those accounts as well, and how soldiers of previous wars were, what kind of treatment were they afforded? What did, for example, what did PTSD look like following a civil war? And there's, all kind of good stories about veterans, and it was present. It's present in every conflict. So what was that like post-Civil War? And then post-World War II, and other wars, and post-Vietnam. We didn't even name PTSD until 1980, 5 years after we were out of there. So I like to read that. Now I like to read the operational pieces, but I like to get the perspectives, the candid, refreshing perspectives of commanders who have been there, who have felt the pain and the pride of what the soldiers are going through, and the weight of and the opportunities and the humbling privilege of command. I like to read about those people who wrote those in their own way. And so some people have written in Patton, World War II, Rommel, even from Germany. Got to know Manfred Rommel, who was the Field Marshal Rommel's son, who was the Lord Mayor of Stuttgart. I got to know him very well in Germany. So I told him when we got back, I said, I'm glad I studied your father and some of his campaigns in North Africa.
Sir, anything I haven't asked you that you want to discuss?
The one piece that I didn't mention specifically is that in all the after-action reviews we did, after Desert Storm and VII Corps, and we all did them, all the units did them. Our bottom line comment was that it was the courage and skill of our soldiers and small unit leadership that made the difference, that achieved that victory. And I think that, to me, is back to the fulfillment of trust. I believe that as a senior commander, you must always be aware of who is doing the tough, hard, oftentimes cruel fighting that goes on in the arena of land combat, in whatever type of war you happen to be in. And see to it that as a senior commander or commander in any level, but see to it that they are trained and ready and prepared to do what you're going to ask them to do, and then get them in the right configuration and keep them that way until they can achieve that final success and that victory. And there's a bond of trust there that you're all together in that, and that our conclusion, and the right conclusion, was that's what achieved the success and victory that in VII Corps, that as part of the coalition liberated Kuwait.
Well, sir, thank you so much for your time. We certainly really appreciate you doing this.
My pleasure.